I think it's safe to say that The Nightmare Before Christmas has cemented itself as not only a holiday classic, but something of a movie masterpiece in general. To this day, it still remains as relevant as ever, which is in part due to how timeless the movie itself is, but also how Disney have kept it in the public eye with all manner of merchandise releasing year after year. It's so beloved in fact that it recently had a cine concert screening in London where the film could be watched alongside music being played by a live orchestra, and even had Danny Elfman return as the singing voice of Jack Skellington. Despite this, and despite the fact that Disney are prone to remaking and sequelizing everything under the sun, The Nightmare Before Christmas remains a completely standalone film which has never received a sequel. A sequel has been on the table for a very long time. In fact, in 2001, Disney were considering doing a second film, but using CGI instead of the original stop-motion animation, but Tim Burton reportedly convinced them to scrap the idea. In 2019, it was said that Disney were once again interested in returning to the film, but this time either as a live-action remake or potentially even a stop-motion sequel. However, this again never came to fruition. The director of the original film, Henry Selick, has continuously added fuel to the fire by suggesting that he would return to direct a sequel, but the story had to be right and it couldn't feel forced. As recently as September 2022, he spoke about his idea to return to Halloween Town, but this time in the form of a series of Disney Plus short films, rather than a true feature-length continuation. Whether or not a live-action, CGI, or maybe even stop-motion sequel ever happens, and whether it takes the form of a feature film or a series of shorts, remains to be seen. But what if I told you that there already was a sequel to the movie? Not one in fact, but there's actually quite a few. The catch of course is that none of them are in the form of a film, and instead they cover all manner of different types of media. So join me as we take a deep dive into all of the different ways that the universe of The Nightmare Before Christmas has been expanded outside of the original movie. The first hint of a story set after the events of the film actually comes from none other than the official soundtrack. The release of the soundtrack actually predates the movie itself, making this the first official Nightmare media ever released. The 19th track on the album features the same narrator who opens the film at the very start, but this time he bookends the experience by offering some insight into what happened after the film, stating, "Things were never the same. Each holiday knew of the other one's name, and that many years later, old Jack was still looking quite thin with 4 or 5 skeleton children." This is such a nice way of wrapping up the events of the film, and it's a shame that this scene isn't featured in the movie itself, acting as a sort of epilogue. Even if it had only been featured in the credits, I still think that that would have been nice. Here, not only do we get clarification that Jack and Sally lived happily for many years after the film, but that they even had children too. It's also interesting from a lore perspective that we're told that the other holidays knew of each other's existences from then on. It almost feels like there's a story to be told about what happened after that. The next sequel wouldn't come until 2005, an entire 12 years after the movie released, which is when we got not one, but 2 video games based on the movie. If you want to be pedantic, one of the games actually came out in 2004 in Japan, but for the rest of the world, we had to wait an extra year. The first of these games is called The Nightmare Before Christmas, Oogie's Revenge, and serves as a direct continuation of the film, being set a year after. Oogie's Revenge was available on the PS2 and Xbox, and is a hack-and-slash style game where you play as Jack as he attempts to save Halloween Town from a resurrected Oogie Boogie who has brainwashed Dr. Finkelstein and forced him to create evil creatures which serve as your main enemies. Oogie's objective this time around is to not only rule over Halloween Town, but seize control over all 7 of the holiday worlds, thus becoming the 7 Holidays King. But of course he's eventually stopped by Jack, and the game ends in much the same way that the film does, with Jack and Sally reuniting on Spiral Hill, and Jack settling into his role as the Pumpkin King once again. To be quite honest, there's not really a whole lot of story development here. We don't get much new lore about the holiday worlds or any of the characters, but it's still nice to be able to freely roam around the locations from the film and even see certain areas that we've never visited before. Like we can go inside some of the crypts in the graveyard or the sewers underneath Halloween Town. The gameplay itself isn't really to my tastes, with me finding beat-em-ups and hack-and-slash games a little bit tedious even when they're considered good ones. But this seemed like a particularly mediocre offering even by my standards. The issue really stems from the fact that there's not a lot of complexity to the combat. You have a standard whip attack and a grab attack, and you can somewhat combine these to do things like pick an enemy up with the grab and then throw them into another enemy with the whip attack. But there's no parry system to block and counter enemies, and there's no perfect dodge mechanic which allows you to do extra damage or anything like that. It's just a bit boring and doesn't feel particularly weighty or satisfying either. Plus, why did they make it so that Jack has to say soul robber every time you use a grab attack?
Soul robber! Soul robber! Soul robber!
That guy too?
Soul robber!
One of the more interesting things about the game is that it actually uses the music from the film. The battle music is the original version of This Is Halloween, and the boss battles actually feature brand new lyrics and vocal performances for some of the songs too. This can be extremely cringy just because it feels so forced, like Jack and Sally singing about how Oogie's plan is causing chaos and how Sally is worried for Jack's safety to the tune of Sally's song. It's just a bit strange. What's pretty cool though is that a lot of the original cast returned for this, which gives the game a lot of authenticity. Ken Page is Oogie, Paul Reubens is Locke, Glenn Shaddix is the Mayor, and even Chris Sarandon returns as none other than Jack himself. Danny Elfman doesn't supply Jack with his singing voice this time though, so we get to hear what things could have sounded like if Chris would have sung in the movie instead, which is pretty interesting.
Just because you fool the town doesn't make you king. You better give up, surrender now. I'm fixing everything.
So while I don't think that Oogie's Revenge is particularly interesting with its gameplay or its expansion of the lore of The Nightmare Before Christmas, what it does offer is one of the best ways to explore Halloween Town and later on even Christmas Town in an interactive way. It's also great hearing some familiar voices reprising their roles, and even the new cast members do a good job of impersonating the movie voices too. It's just a shame that the gameplay ends up getting stale quite fast. The second and last video game released in the series is technically not a sequel, but instead a prequel, telling us the story of how Jack met Oogie in the first place, and shows the first meeting between Jack and Sally too. This is called The Nightmare Before Christmas: The Pumpkin King, and was exclusively released on the Game Boy Advance. There's actually a lot of misinformation spread about this game's story, and even the Nightmare Before Christmas wiki gets some details wrong. For example, on the wiki it states that the game is set approximately 1 year before the film, but within the game itself it actually states that the game is set many years before the film, implying that a lot of time passes between this game and the movie. The wiki also states that this game is Jack's first year of being the Pumpkin King, but no such thing is explicitly said in the game. In fact, Jack says, "Tonight they will all see why I am called the Pumpkin King," which sort of implies that he's been the Pumpkin King for a while. It could be that this is his first time, but I wouldn't say that that's completely concrete information. Either way, Oogie gets word from Lock, Shock and Barrel that Jack is the Pumpkin King of Halloween Town and is the scariest guy around. Oogie thinks that he's scarier though, and it's stated in the manual that after his own holiday isn't being celebrated, he wants to overthrow Jack and take over Halloween instead. The manual is the only time that it's mentioned that Oogie once had his own holiday, and it's not even specified what the holiday was about. You'll find information online that says it was called Bug Day, but again, this has no actual source in the game or the manual. Either way though, Lock, Shock and Barrel go to kidnap Jack so that Oogie can dispose of him, but they end up taking Sally instead, which is a nice little throwback to how they kidnap the Easter Bunny instead of Santa in the film. The boys recognise Sally as being Dr. Finkelstein's new assistant, and Oogie becomes infuriated, sending his bugs to overthrow Halloween Town and destroy Jack. The game then consists of Jack navigating Halloween Town, destroying Oogie's bug minions, and helping out all of the different residents in lots of ways. For example, Dr. Finkelstein's lab has gone haywire and the security needs to be turned off, the Wolfman is being attacked by leeches, and the mayor needs help with finding ingredients for his lunch. By completing these different objectives, not only will Jack get closer to Oogie's lair, but he also gains new equipment which gives him access to new attacks and new ways to navigate the environment too. In this way, the game is actually structured very similarly to a Metroidvania game, being openly designed and allowing you to backtrack to previous areas with new abilities in order to discover areas that were previously inaccessible. This is way more ambitious than I was thinking it was going to be, and I actually quite enjoyed exploring and seeing all of the locations from the film remade on a handheld console. Obviously they had to take a lot of creative liberties here to make it work, but the result is something that still looks recognisable as a Nightmare Before Christmas game. What helps here is that all of the music is a chiptune rendition of songs from the film, and unlike with the Oogie's Revenge game, it actually isn't too repetitive, with each area having a different theme to go alongside it. As good as This Is Halloween is, hearing it every single time you enter any sort of combat got a little bit boring. The animation of the characters is also pretty impressive, being smooth and having tons of character too. Like how the mayor always spins into frame shouting at you in panic, or how Jack will pull himself onto ledges using his legs, with him being so nimble and spider-like. I absolutely loved the callbacks to the confrontation with Oogie in the film too. Things like Oogie's obsession with gambling is replicated in this game by having one of his boss fights consist of him rolling a dice which affects the environment in different ways. The cards which spin daggers around that are seen in the film also appear here, and even the slot machines with guns can be seen too. This is amazing, and you can tell that the developers loved the source material. The dialogue, while obviously only being text-based this time, feels so consistent with the dialogue from the film, and it's like you can actually hear the voices saying the words because it feels that authentic. Now this isn't to say that the game is perfect by any means, and actually there's quite a lot of major issues with it if I'm being honest. Some of the platforming and general movement can feel a bit stiff and awkward. The world can be extremely confusing to navigate because certain areas will just look identical to each other. The combat is extremely basic, and you'll often just have to tank hits to get around enemies and bosses. And I feel like it's probably a bit too long for its own good too. Making you visit every single area of the game twice was probably a mistake, and the second visit should have been completely optional. Underneath all that though, there is a good game here, and I would actually probably say that I preferred this to Oogie's Revenge. That's probably a weird opinion, but hey, I guess I'm just a weird guy. The big reason that I think this game is better is because while Oogie's Revenge doesn't really offer much in terms of story development or lore building, the Pumpkin King actually does show us some pivotal scenes. We see the exact moment where Jack first learns of Sally's existence, with him being told about her by the mayor at the start of the game. Jack also learns more about Oogie, with the mayor calling him a recluse who lives in a lair under the treehouse. And upon the first meeting, Oogie tells Jack that he wants to turn Halloween into Crawloween, and later says that he wants to rename Halloween Town to Bugtown. This guy really has an obsession with bugs, but I guess that makes sense with him literally being made of them. The final boss is insanely difficult, but not really for any legitimate reason. It's just because it has tons of health and doesn't open itself up to damage very much. Also because Jack takes up so much of the screen due to how tall he is and how sort of squashed the screen was due to it being on the GBA, it makes it very difficult to avoid attacks yourself. I spent a good hour on this fight and it was pretty damn annoying. After this though, Oogie accepts defeat and then Jack berates him for messing with Halloween Town. Oogie is then banished to the room under the treehouse and Jack implies that he'll kill him if he ever leaves. Jack really has a bit of a mean side, but I guess I would be mean too if my town was taken over by bugs. We then get the first ever face-to-face meeting of Jack and Sally as she thanks him for saving her. The two share a moment before being interrupted by the mayor, who asks Jack to hurry up because Halloween night is starting, and Dr. Finkelstein appears and is pleased to see Sally safe and wants her to come home. A final shot of Oogie shows him very bitter about being banished, and he states that he's not finished yet and that when he returns, it will be a nightmare, thus setting up the events of the film. A pretty great ending, even if that last boss battle was a complete pain to get through. Once again, it was a very long time until we got any type of continuation, with us needing to wait until 2018, 13 years after Oogie's revenge in the Pumpkin King, and a whole 25 years after the film. This is when we received The Nightmare Before Christmas: Zero's Journey, a graphic novel which is another sequel to the film. If we were to put the current pieces of Nightmare media onto a timeline, I suspect that it would look like this. First of all, we have the Pumpkin King, then the movie itself, then Oogie's revenge, and then finally the epilogue featured in the soundtrack. Zero's Journey would have to go after Oogie's revenge due to the fact that it's heavily implied that this game is set a year after the film in this bit of dialogue.
Halloween? A fresh, new, and improved Halloween, Doctor. After last year, we can't just do the same old thing.
An interesting thing to note regarding the timeline placement of Zero's journey is that Jack is shown at the start of the book to be working on a portal device which will allow him to travel between all of the holiday realms with much more ease. This implies that he's already been to the other holiday towns by this point, which is an important detail to remember for later. You could also make an assumption that when Jack leaves Halloween Town at the start of Oogie's revenge to look for inspiration for the next year's festivities, that he might actually visit the other holidays for the first time at this point. Again, keep this in mind for when we revisit this timeline later. For now though, let's get back to the topic at hand. Now, before doing a ton of research on Zero's journey, I was actually under the impression that it was a manga and not a traditional comic. This is incorrect though, and it was originally printed as 20 single issues of a comic series before being converted into 4 bigger volumes, each collecting 5 of the original comics. It's at that point that an all-in-one version called the Ultimate Manga Edition released. The version I have is the Ultimate Manga Edition, in part because I thought this was the best way of reading through it, with it being the whole story in one book, but also because I've been reading and collecting a lot of manga recently. The thing is though, is that the original comics and the 4 collected volumes are actually in full colour and are formatted slightly differently to the manga, so I kind of feel like I've read an inferior version, which is a bit annoying. Still, that aside, Zero's journey follows a story where Zero accidentally goes through the Christmas holiday door after flying after a bone that Jack throws for him, which goes out of control. Zero ends up completely lost and has to get help from the different inhabitants in Christmas Town, while Jack sends Lock, Shock and Barrel to look for him because he needs to prepare for Halloween, which is right around the corner. The Lock, Shock and Barrel subplot doesn't really offer much in terms of story development. Instead, we just see them causing chaos as they steal sweets and chocolate and go about their plan of taking all of the presents. The more interesting side of things comes from Zero, who bumps into an elf who becomes enraged after Zero unknowingly eats the leg of his living gingerbread man friend. There's a strangely moving backstory we learn about this elf though, because it turns out that he hates Christmas after he received a pet dog and it was killed in an accident after it ran after a ball that he threw. At first I was thinking, oh my god, this is huge, it's gonna turn out that Zero is the elf's long lost dog and they're finally gonna be reunited. After all, the dog's name was 1, which lines up with Zero now being called Zero, like it's the number of lives he has or something. But no, it turns out that apparently 1 is just another dog entirely and Zero just reminds him of his old friend. I definitely think that you could come up with some sort of theory that Zero is still one, but the story doesn't really ever explore that. What is interesting though is that we get to see a side of Christmas Town that we've never seen before. It's always been shown to be a place where everyone is merry and jolly, but there's a darker side to the world presented here, which is really engaging. First we saw the Christmas-hating elf, but another darker element is shown in a scene where Lock, Shock and Barrel infiltrate Santa's workshop, and we find out that a manager elf is straight up forcing the other elves to work faster in order to get all of the presents made. He's even shown to have the ability to hypnotise the elves, and even Lock, Shock and Barrel themselves into working harder. Santa doesn't even seem to care too much that this is happening either, and might even be fine with it. He only cares when Zero eventually leads him to Lock, Shock and Barrel, and he recognises them as the kids who kidnapped him in the film. We then get a nice moment where Santa talks to Lock, Shock and Barrel and tries to get them to see the difference between being naughty and nice, which they don't seem to understand. But before Santa can do some kind of therapist session with them, Zero is asked to light the candle on top of the tree. But then a jealous reindeer pushes him out of the way and the whole place goes up in flames. Jack finally decides to take some action after Zero has been gone for so long and enters Christmas Town himself, along with several other residents of Halloween Town who have never been there in person before. Zero works together with the jealous reindeer to put the flames out, while Lock, Shock and Barrel attempt to steal presents while everyone else is distracted by the fire. But of course their plan fails, and Zero is celebrated as a hero after he saves the presents and the workshop from going up in flames. Of course, Zero is also reunited with Jack at the end, and they all go back to Halloween Town together. Overall, I quite liked this story, and even though there's not anything too extreme in terms of lore development, it is really cool seeing more of Christmas Town and seeing a darker side to it with the Christmas-hating elf and the weird workaholic elf manager. These darker elements aren't really ever fully fleshed out though, which is slightly disappointing, and it probably leaves us asking more questions than anything else, but it is still interesting. If there was one fairly major thing that I didn't like, it was how certain scenes are written as if they're songs. But it comes off as a little bit janky because we don't know what tune it's supposed to be in or anything. I get that they wanted to replicate the musical element of the film, but it probably would have been better if they didn't try this. We actually didn't need to wait too long for the next sequel because 3 years later in 2021 we got another comic called The Nightmare Before Christmas Mirror Moon. This one is a lot less talked about than any of the other things we've mentioned so far, and that's probably because it had less publicity, and it's also significantly shorter than Zero's journey too, only being 5 issues long originally before being collected into one complete volume. There's no manga version at all this time around, which is pretty annoying because I wanted all of this Nightmare stuff to be on the shelf together, but the manga is separate from the comics and it has to stay like that. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Anyway, that aside, Mirror Moon is most likely set after Zero's journey, although it could quite easily be set before, considering that there's nothing presented that suggests otherwise. But because it was released after Zero's journey, it's just an assumption that it's also set after. The story here is about Jack inventing a mirror which can duplicate objects, sounds and even people, and he wants to use this to more effectively prepare for Halloween. The idea is that rather than having to carve loads of pumpkins or spin lots of spider webs, you could instead make one of those things and then duplicate them with the mirror. If this is a success, he could even spread the workload on the inhabitants of Halloween Town by duplicating the citizens themselves, meaning less work for everyone. Sally is skeptical about this idea from the beginning, with her having a vision of a lake freezing and then her touching it and smashing it, which she assumes means she's going to end up breaking the mirror and ruining Jack's plans. After witnessing this, she quickly discovers that clones of everyone are running around town causing chaos, even though Jack hasn't actually started using the mirror yet, and it turns out that because of the way the mirror is placed in Jack's house, it's reflecting out of the window and duplicating everyone that passes by. These clones are helpful when told what to do, but when left to their own devices, they act more immaturely than the normal residents and start destroying things. Luckily though, Sally quickly realises that sunlight makes the clones disappear and uses this knowledge to save Halloween for everyone. To be honest, this is by far my least favourite of these sequels. The story is extremely basic and there's hardly any stakes presented. As quickly as the threat of the clones is presented, they're immediately defeated. The logic barely makes any sense either. It's not explained why the clones are destroying things, and the dream Jack has at the start of the story where all of the holiday doors open at the same time is never elaborated on. There's absolutely no development of characters, and we don't learn anything new about the Nightmare universe either. There's a moment when Sally goes to the pumpkin patch to check on how things are going, and she bumps into Jack's pumpkin outfit seen at the start of the film. But rather than being a costume worn by Jack, it's instead an actual sentient being called Gord. I don't know if this is a fundamental misunderstanding that the writers of Mirror Moon had of the original text, or if they were just taking some massive creative liberties here, but this strikes me as very odd. There's even another bit where Oogie is just walking through the town as if he's a normal member of society, which is really weird. If it wasn't for the fact that the holiday doors were mentioned, I would be assuming that this was a prequel to the film somehow, but yeah, it just doesn't feel very true to the canon, which is disappointing. I really don't think you'd be missing out on anything if you just gave this particular story a miss. The only people I could recommend this to at all are die-hard fans of the series who need to own everything Nightmare Before Christmas related. This brings us to the current year of 2022, and you might be thinking, surely there's nothing else left for us to talk about that released so recently. But there is in fact one last sequel in the form of a novel written by Shea Earnshaw called The Nightmare Before Christmas: Long Live the Pumpkin Queen. This book is written from the perspective of Sally and is set a year after the film, where Jack and Sally are getting married and she becomes the first ever Pumpkin Queen of Halloween Town. Sally struggles with this though and feels a lot of pressure coming from everybody to live up to being a queen and to become a leader, and she simply wants a quiet life with Jack. Just like she was when she was Dr. Finkelstein's prisoner, she starts to feel like a captive again and runs away to the holiday doors looking for some peace. She ends up walking even further than the 7 holiday doors and finds an 8th door which has been covered in vines, hidden for potentially years from anyone. She opens it but decides not to enter due to the potential danger. Getting back to Halloween Town after a day has passed though, she finds everyone is asleep and covered in a strange sand-like substance. It turns out that a strange monster called the Sandman has been putting everybody to sleep and they can't be woken up no matter what. Even Jack has fallen victim to this, and she starts to panic and heads to all 6 of the other holiday towns in order to look for help, only to find that everybody is asleep. Now this is super interesting because this marks the first time that we've ever gotten a description of what the other holidays besides Christmas and Halloween look like. The one that's the most fleshed out is Valentine's Town because Sally and Jack go there together on the honeymoon at the start of the book, with this being the only one that Jack hasn't previously gone to because he wanted to visit it with Sally. Needless to say, it's amazing after all of these years to finally get some kind of idea as to what these places look like, and the book is excellently written so that you can picture everything really clearly. Sally eventually needs to enter the secret door that she found earlier and discovers that she left it open when she first found it, meaning that the Sandman monster came from this door and there was a reason it was hidden and barricaded. With no other options though, she enters it, and from there, there's several huge developments with Nightmare Before Christmas lore. I will quickly mention some major things that happen here, so if you want to avoid spoilers for this with it being quite new, there's a timestamp on the screen here to skip this section. So the first revelation is that this door leads to a place called Dreamtown, which is where dreams are made, and the inhabitants come up with ways to help children and even adults get good sleep. This is obviously different from the other doors because this one isn't about a holiday, but instead it's about a concept. The second huge plot development is that Sally comes across the governors of the town and discovered that they're ragdolls too. And not only that, but they had a daughter who went missing years ago who was named Sally. She learns that Dr. Finkelstein knew of Dreamtown's existence long before the holiday doors were discovered and entered it as a young scientist in order to steal something to pass off as his own invention. It was there that he found Sally and knew that if he could get away with saying that he created her, then he would become respected in Halloween Town. So he kidnapped Sally, removed her cotton innards and replaced them with dead leaves from Halloween Town, gave her a potion to make her forget where she was from, and got away with all of it. Sally's newfound parents decide that in order to stop the Sandman from entering their town ever again, they're gonna destroy their version of the holiday portals. Sally begs them to stop, saying that her husband and friends will be lost forever, but they do it anyway. In her desperation, Sally eventually comes up with a plan that would have worked to have made the Sandman go to sleep, using a potion with ingredients from Halloween Town. This would have been far more potent than the sleeping potions crafted in Dreamtown. But now, because the holiday doors have been destroyed, the only way of getting back to Halloween Town is by entering the real world and getting to a cemetery. She enters the real world only to find out that the entire planet has been put to sleep by the Sandman. With him now having access to every portal, he can freely enter the real world too, just like Jack and Santa do in the film. So now we have an apocalyptic event on our hands, and the stakes are way higher than anything we've ever seen in The Nightmare Before Christmas before. Sally eventually gets back to Halloween Town though, and eventually defeats the Sandman and wakes everybody up. It turns out that the Sandman was desperate to get some kind of sleep, and so put everybody else to sleep to try and steal their dreams. Sally's potion actually managed to put him to sleep for the first time in years, and now that he's had some rest, he isn't so bad. Despite saying that they were going to destroy the entrance to the real world after Sally left, Sally's parents appear in Halloween Town and say that they didn't end up doing that after all. It's here that they finally meet her friends and her husband, Jack. We then get an epilogue set some time after, where all of the residents of all of the holidays freely visit each other, and Halloween Town has expanded and set up cafes and hotels for people to stay at. Jack and Sally enter the woods together to reminisce and get away from it all, but then discover a whole orchard of trees with doors in them, which were previously undiscovered, meaning that there's tons more towns for them to visit, and they devote themselves to exploring them all together. I should mention too that once Jack finds out what Dr. Finkelstein did, he banishes him to work in Dreamtown to pay off his debt to Sally's parents. Sally states that even after 100 years, Jack will probably still have not forgiven him, so it's unlikely that the Doctor would ever be a normal resident of Halloween Town ever again. He'd most likely get banished to the tree house where Oogie once resided, but that's just speculation on my part. But yeah, this arguably has even more story development than the actual film has. While there are parts which are maybe a little bit weird, like the apocalyptic threat presented by the Sandman and the fact that at one point Sally visits Queen Elizabeth for some reason, I would say that this is probably the best sequel to the original film that we've ever had. I think Sally's arc in this is incredibly well done, and like I said earlier, it's extremely well written. It's not overly long either, and I actually read the whole thing in a day, which I don't normally do with novels. It was great, and if you're a fan of the film and want a little bit more, I highly recommend it. The question is though, where does this fit on the Nightmare Before Christmas timeline? Well, this is where my timeline of events gets completely messed up, because this book completely contradicts several things that we know from the comics and the games. First of all, it's never mentioned in Oogie's Revenge, Zero's Journey, or Mirror Moon that Jack and Sally are married. Now, you could make a case that maybe this just isn't mentioned, but that seems extremely unlikely. Sally also mentions that she's never been to Christmas Town or any of the other holiday worlds, which again doesn't line up with Zero's Journey, where she's explicitly shown visiting Christmas Town. The only possible way that you can fit everything into one timeline is like this. The Pumpkin King is the first thing, which kind of exists on its own because it's the only prequel, so that's fine. Then obviously we have the film with everything else taking place after this. Then we have Long Live the Pumpkin Queen, which explicitly is said to be set a year after the events of the film, specifically being 2 weeks before Halloween. Then we have Oogie's Revenge, where Jack might revisit the other holiday realms looking for discoveries to make Halloween better. His first visits to the other holiday realms is described in Long Live the Pumpkin Queen. Then we have Zero's Journey, where Jack is shown to be working on a holiday portal to quickly navigate between the worlds. Then we have Mirror Moon. And then we have the epilogue to Long Live the Pumpkin Queen, where all of the holiday realms freely visit each other, and Halloween Town even has hotels and cafes for everybody. And then finally we have the epilogue in the soundtrack, which must be set way after because Jack and Sally are older and have children. You have to really ignore or work around certain details for this to work though. Like the fact that Sally isn't wearing a new outfit she creates at the end of Long Live the Pumpkin Queen. And perhaps the most damning piece of evidence which blows the whole thing apart is that Dr. Finkelstein is shown to still be in Halloween Town and being friendly with Jack after the events of Long Live the Pumpkin Queen. Basically, it doesn't fit all into one timeline unless you say, hey, maybe Jack just forgave Finkelstein and really quickly moved on. But honestly, it straight up doesn't work. The timeline is busted. There is a solution to this though, which is fairly straightforward, and you've probably been yelling it at me for ages now. And this is simply that they don't all exist in one timeline. So I would say that the primary timeline consists of the film, Long Live the Pumpkin Queen, and the epilogue of the soundtrack. The secondary timeline consists of the comics and manga. This timeline actually starts with the manga adaptation of the film rather than the film itself, and then goes on to Zero's Journey and Mirror Moon. That way, all of the graphic novel style things can be considered their own complete canon. Then we have a third timeline that consists of the games, where first we have the Pumpkin King, then the film, and then Oogie's Revenge. This way, everything is kept completely consistent, and we've got ourselves a nightmare multiverse on our hands. You could even be extra silly and add in other universes which feature the Kingdom Hearts appearances of the series, but that's going too far for the scope of this video. You might be thinking that this is everything, but it turns out that extremely recently, yet another comic was announced in the form of The Nightmare Before Christmas, The Battle for the Pumpkin King, which is a prequel to the film. This will show Jack and Oogie's first confrontation, where, judging from the title, they probably battle for who gets to become the Pumpkin King. Our original timeline would have been destroyed by this too, because this would have contradicted the Game Boy Advance game, which is shown to be the first time that Jack and Oogie meet. Unless Battle for the Pumpkin King was set slightly after that, but no, I think this belongs in the second timeline and will chronologically be set first there. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the Battle for the Pumpkin King though, and it'll no doubt be interesting to flick through. With all of this Nightmare Before Christmas content releasing quite recently, it's making me wonder if there's going to be a big announcement anytime soon about a proper film sequel of some kind. But honestly, I would be okay if that never happened. We've already got all of this other nightmare stuff to dive into, and the film is amazing just on its own anyway, so it doesn't really need anything else. While The Nightmare Before Christmas remains a lone movie for now, I hope you found it interesting exploring the hidden depths of the Nightmare universe with me. If you did enjoy the video and maybe even learned something about Jack and the gang that you didn't know before, give the video a like and subscribe for more stuff like this coming soon. And with all of that out of the way, there's nothing left to say apart from I'll see you next time. Bye!